Right now, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, more car loans are 90 days past due than at any point in over a decade, not during a recession, not during a crisis, right now, in a strong economy with unemployment low and paychecks steady. Here's what most people believe. Falling behind on a car payment happens to people who overspend, who buy more car than they can afford. New data says otherwise. Solid earners, people with stable six-figure jobs, are falling behind at rates we haven't seen in years. So if it's not about how much people make, what is it about? That answer traces back to a single decision the auto industry made decades ago. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And every month you don't, that squeezed feeling on payday quietly gets worse. My name is Alex. If you've ever stared at a solid paycheck wondering where it went, stick with me. Because the answer usually has nothing to do with your spending habits. I'm going to show you exactly how modern car payments were built to work against you and what they're quietly costing you over a working lifetime. Once you understand this, you will never look at a monthly payment the same way again. And once you know what to look for, the scale of this becomes impossible to ignore. America's $1.7 trillion car debt problem. Here's a number that should stop you for a second. There are currently more open auto loans in this country than there are people in Germany and France combined. That's not an exaggeration. It's roughly 108 million open accounts, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. 108 million monthly payments, most of them treated as background noise, sitting quietly underneath people's paychecks every single month. Take Renata Slocum. She's a physical therapist outside Charlotte, North Carolina, and she makes good money. $91,000 a year, no kids, no big debts besides the usual. And still, every month she watches $481 leave her account for a car she barely thinks about anymore. It's just there, like a subscription she forgot to cancel, except this one is attached to a 2-ton object parked in her driveway. Renata's payment isn't even the alarming part. It's what's happening around her, at scale, that should get your attention. Auto loan debt nationwide currently sits at $1.685 trillion. Let that number sit for a second, because it just crossed something significant. It's now larger than every student loan balance in America combined. For years, we treated student debt as the crisis, the thing politicians argued about, the thing that showed up in headlines. Car debt quietly passed it, and almost nobody noticed. Why? Because student loans announce themselves. People talk about them. They complain about them at dinner parties. Car payments don't get that treatment. They're seen as normal, expected, a rite of passage into adulthood, even though the math behind them has changed dramatically in just a few years. Here's the part that explains why. The average new car in America currently costs $49,353. 10 years ago, that number was closer to $35,000. Prices didn't creep up. They exploded, and the payment followed right behind them. The average monthly payment on a new car currently sits at a record $770, and the average amount financed is $43,925. Now think about what $49,000 actually buys elsewhere. That's close to what you'd pay for a fully loaded Toyota Highlander XLE, sitting right at the entry point for a base Ford F-150 XLT Super Crew. It's not a luxury number. It's an ordinary, unremarkable new car, and people are financing it like it's ordinary and unremarkable too. That's exactly the trap. Because $770 a month feels manageable. It fits inside a budget. It doesn't feel like $44,000 of debt, even though that's precisely what it is. And that gap between how a payment feels and what it actually costs is not an accident. It didn't happen by chance. It was built that way, on purpose, by an industry that figured out a long time ago that people don't scrutinize a monthly number the way they'd scrutinize a total one. Why dealerships only ask about payments? Ask yourself something. The last time you walked into a dealership, or even browsed online, what was the very first question you were asked? If you're like most people, it wasn't, "What's your budget?" It was, "What payment are you looking for?" That's not a coincidence, and it's not a small detail either. It's the entire business model, hiding in plain sight. Take Dwayne Ferris. He's an operations manager at a logistics company outside Phoenix, Arizona, and last spring he walked into a dealership planning to spend maybe $30,000 on a reliable used SUV. 2 hours later, he drove off in a new one, financed for $46,000. Because somewhere in that conversation, the salesperson stopped asking about price entirely and started asking again and again what payment felt comfortable. Dwayne never noticed the shift. That's the point. It's not supposed to be noticed. Here's why that question matters so much. If a dealer had to hand you a piece of paper that said $44,000, which is currently the average amount financed on a new car, your brain would slow down. You'd hesitate. You'd start doing math you don't want to do at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning. But if that same dealer says $770 a month, which happens to be the current national average payment, your brain barely blinks. It sounds like a subscription. It sounds like something you already afford. That's the whole strategy. And it works because of a pretty basic quirk in how people process numbers. A big number triggers scrutiny. A monthly number triggers comfort. Dealerships figured that out decades ago, and they built their entire sales process around it. Now here's where it gets more interesting. Once you tell a salesperson your comfortable monthly number, you've essentially handed them the blueprint for how to maximize what they take from you. They can stretch your loan term longer, because a longer term lowers the monthly number, even if it raises the total cost. They can pad the deal with extended warranties and gap insurance, because those get folded into the payment too, quietly, without ever standing out on their own. And they can adjust your interest rate, sometimes without you fully realizing it's negotiable at all. Why would they do that? Follow the incentive. The finance manager at a dealership typically earns a commission on the interest rate markup, not the sticker price. Their job isn't just to sell you a car. It's to sell you the most profitable version of a car loan that still fits inside the number you gave them at the start of the conversation. Think about the psychology here for a second, because it really is clever. Dwayne told the dealership he was comfortable around $650 a month. They didn't fight that number. They built an entire loan structure around hitting it exactly. Term length, add-ons, rate, all of it engineered backward from his comfort level, rather than forward from what the car should actually cost. And this is where the real damage starts to show up, because when a payment gets stretched out over 6 or 7 years just to keep that monthly number comfortable, something else happens underneath the surface. The loan starts moving slower than the car's value does. That gap between what people still owe and what their car is actually worth is where things start to get genuinely expensive. How negative equity traps car buyers. Here's a strange question. Is it possible to owe more money on something the day you replace it than you did when you first bought it? Most people would say, no, that doesn't make sense. But it's happening to nearly 1 in 3 car buyers in America right now. And most of them don't realize it until they're standing in a dealership finding out the hard way. Take Yolanda Briggs. She teaches middle school outside Tampa, Florida. And 3 years ago, she financed a Chevrolet Tahoe. Reasonable payment, reasonable plan. Last month, she went to trade it in for something smaller, something better on gas, and the finance manager delivered the number. She still owed more on the loan than the truck was worth, $7,200 more, to be specific, which happens to be almost exactly the current national average. So how does that even happen? It comes down to 2 things moving at completely different speeds, and almost nobody explains it clearly before you sign the paperwork. A new car loses value fast. Within the first year, it's down roughly 20%. By year 5, the average vehicle has lost about 60% of what you originally paid. That's the asset side of the equation, and it's dropping like a stone from the moment you drive away. Your loan balance does not drop like that. It falls on a slow, steady schedule, especially in the early years, when most of each payment is going toward interest rather than the actual balance. So you end up with 2 lines on a graph. One is falling off a cliff, the other is easing down a gentle slope. And for a long stretch in the middle, the falling line sits below the sloping one. That gap between them is negative equity, and right now it's affecting close to 31% of everyone trading in a car for a new one. Here's where it compounds, and this is the part that really deserves your attention. When someone in Yolanda's position trades in a car she's underwater on, that $7,200 gap doesn't just disappear. It gets rolled into the new loan. So now she's not financing the new car's actual price. She's financing the new car plus the debt from the old one, all bundled together like it never happened. That's exactly why buyers who roll negative equity into a new loan currently finance about $11,000 more, on average, than buyers who aren't underwater. And to keep that bigger number looking like a manageable monthly payment, most of them stretch the loan out even further. Right now, Over 40% of buyers rolling negative equity into a new purchase are signing 7-year loans just to make the payment fit. Do you see the shape of this? It's not one bad decision. It's a cycle. Buy a car, fall behind the depreciation curve, trade it in still owing money, roll that debt forward, stretch the new loan longer to cover it, and repeat. Buyers stuck in this pattern are now paying a record $916 a month, compared to the $770 national average. That's not a coincidence. That's the cost of the cycle showing up in real time. And here's the thing, a lot of people think they've found the loophole out of all this. They think if they just avoid the loan altogether and lease instead, none of this applies to them. That's not quite true either. Leasing doesn't solve the debt problem. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If leasing means you never have to deal with negative equity, why do so many people who lease end up back in a dealership every 3 years, still with nothing to show for it? That's the part nobody mentions in the pitch. Leasing gets sold as the smart alternative, the workaround, the way to sidestep everything we just walked through. And on paper, it looks clean. Lower payment, newer car, no trade-in headaches. But the math underneath tells a different story. Take Foster DeLuca. He's a pharmaceutical sales rep based outside Cleveland, Ohio. And for the last 9 years, he's leased a new BMW X5 every 3 years. Like clockwork. Right now, his payment sits close to $619 a month, which happens to be almost exactly the national average lease payment today. Foster likes to say he's never had a car payment problem, because technically he's never owned a car long enough to fall underwater on one. But here's the number that should bother him, and it took me a minute to actually run it myself. 9 years of leasing at roughly that payment adds up to about $66,000. Foster doesn't own a single vehicle, not one. He has spent enough money to buy a fully loaded Toyota Highlander in cash, twice over, and walk away with nothing. That's the mechanism leasing hides. When you finance a car, you're at least building equity somewhere in that loan, even if depreciation is working against you. When you lease, you're renting the single steepest depreciation window a car will ever go through, the first 3 years, and handing every bit of that value straight back to the manufacturer when the term ends. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, but at least leasing avoids that whole underwater trade-in mess we just talked about. And on the surface, that's true. But look at what replaces it. Most leases cap you around 10 to 12,000 miles a year, and going over that costs somewhere between 15 and 25 cents per mile. Billed the day you turn the car in. Excess wear charges work the same way. A scuffed bumper or a stained seat that you'd shrug off on a car you own becomes a line item bill on a car you were only ever borrowing. So the underwater feeling doesn't disappear with leasing. It just changes shape. Instead of owing more than the car is worth, you're paying full price for the years a car depreciates fastest, then handing the keys back with zero ownership, zero equity, and often an unexpected bill on your way out the door. Here's the reframe that matters. A car loan is expensive because of the trap we already covered, the payment psychology, the stretched terms, the negative equity. A lease is expensive for a completely different reason. It's not really transportation you're financing. It's newness. And newness, it turns out, might be the single most costly thing you can consistently pay for over a working lifetime. Foster isn't wrong that he avoided one specific trap. He just walked into a different one, dressed up to look like the responsible choice. So if financing traps you and leasing quietly drains you, what does actually breaking free from all of this look like in real dollars over real time? What that monthly payment costs you long term? Here's a question most people never let themselves ask, mostly because the answer is uncomfortable. What if the $770 leaving your account every month isn't actually a car payment? What if it's a retirement payment, just aimed in the wrong direction? Stick with me on this one, because the math is more interesting than the question makes it sound. Take Gordon Whitfield. He's an operations director at a distribution center outside Kansas City, Missouri, 54 years old, and currently financing a Ford F-150 Platinum for $718 a month. Gordon's not reckless. He's careful with money in almost every other area of his life. He just never sat down and asked what that specific monthly number was quietly costing him, year after year, decade after decade. So let's actually run it the way Gordon never did. If you take $770, the current national average car payment, and instead put it into a basic index fund, averaging 8% a year, here's what happens. Over 20 years, that becomes roughly $453,000. Not because you got lucky, not because you picked some brilliant stock, just because money left alone, invested consistently, grows on its own timeline. Stretch that same $770 out to 25 years, and you're looking at around $732,000. For someone Gordon's age, with 15 to 20 working years still ahead of him, that's not an abstract number. That's the difference between retiring comfortably and retiring anxious. That's the difference between a retirement account that covers his life and one that covers his groceries. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable, and I think it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Gordon's current truck, fully loaded, financed at today's rates, isn't dramatically different in price from a Range Rover Autobiography P53. Oh, I'm not saying that to shame him. I'm saying it because most people don't realize how close the responsible purchase and the outright luxury purchase have gotten. The gap used to be enormous. Currently, it's shockingly small. And that's really the heart of this section. It's not that spending money on a car is wrong. It's that most people have no idea what the money is actually doing while it's tied up in one. Every dollar going toward that payment is a dollar that isn't compounding anywhere else. It's not sitting in an account working quietly in the background. It's sitting in a driveway, losing value, going nowhere. Think about what $450,000 could actually become in someone's life. That's close to the asking price on a 3-bedroom place in Door County, Wisconsin, right on the water. The kind of property people spend their whole career dreaming about retiring into. That's a Rolex date just 41, bought outright in cash with 6 figures left over. That's not a fantasy. That's just what $770 a month, redirected, actually turns into overtime. Gordon isn't going to sell his truck tomorrow. That's not really the point. The point is that once you see the number this clearly, you can't keep pretending the payment is neutral. It's not sitting still. It's either building something for you, or it's quietly building something for someone else. And once you start looking at money this way, a strange thing happens. You start noticing the difference between people who look wealthy and people who actually are. Looking rich versus actually being rich. Here's something worth noticing next time you're stopped at a red light. The car in the lane next to you tells you almost nothing true about the person driving it. That sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but most of us don't actually operate that way, do we? We still glance at a Range Rover or a Porsche Cayenne and quietly assume something about the person behind the wheel. That assumption is exactly what the entire system we've been walking through depends on. Take Estelle Marchetti. She's a dental hygienist in a suburb outside Denver, Colorado, and she drives a 5-year-old Toyota Highlander, paid off, no loan, nothing owed on it. Nobody at a stoplight looks twice at Estelle's car, and yet Estelle currently has just over $400,000 sitting in a brokerage account, built almost entirely from redirecting what would have been a car payment for the last decade. Nobody knows that either. That's the part that should really sit with you for a second. Now put Estelle next to someone like Foster from a few minutes ago, the pharmaceutical rep leasing a new BMW every 3 years. At a glance, Foster looks like the success story. Newer car, nicer badge, that fresh off the lot shine. But we already walked through his numbers. 9 years, $66,000 spent, and he owns none of it. This is the gap most people never examine, because we're not really trained to. We're trained to read wealth visually. A Birkin 30 in Togo leather signals something. A Rolex Daytona signals something. A private jet like a Cessna Citation CJ4 sitting on a tarmac signals something loudly. But visible signals and actual net worth are two completely different measurements. And currently, for a huge number of Americans, they're moving in opposite directions. Here's the uncomfortable version of that idea. A $770 car payment and a genuinely wealthy person's investment contribution can look identical on a bank statement. Same number leaving the account. Completely different destination. One disappears into a depreciating asset. The other compounds quietly for 20 years and becomes a paid-off home on the water in a place like Sarasota, Florida. The kind of listing that runs past $2 million in the right neighborhood. So here's the actual takeaway. And I don't think it's really about cars at all. It's about which version of looking successful you're optimizing for. The version everyone else can see at a stoplight. Or the version only your future self ever gets to see, in an account balance and a paid-off mortgage, in the freedom to actually retire when you want to instead of when you have to. That's not a knock on nice cars. Estelle isn't anti-Range Rover, and I'm not either. It's just that once you understand the mechanism behind the payment, once you've seen the psychology, the negative equity, the leasing trap, and the real cost of that money sitting somewhere other than compounding, the decision stops being about whether you can afford the payment. It becomes about what you're quietly choosing to give up in exchange for it. And that's a very different question than the one most people are actually asking at the dealership, which brings us back to the number we started with and why it should probably bother you a little more than it currently does. The payment nobody questions. A car payment isn't dangerous because of the number. It's dangerous because nobody questions it. That's the whole thing we just walked through. Not bad math, just math nobody bothered to run. Few things worth carrying with you. The payment was designed to hide the total. Negative equity turns one bad loan into a cycle. Leasing doesn't remove the cost, it just changes its shape. And money not going toward a payment doesn't disappear. It compounds quietly somewhere else. So next time you're sitting in a dealership or just glancing at your own loan, ask yourself one real question. Not, can I afford this payment? But, what does this payment cost me 20 years from now? That single shift in framing changes almost every decision that follows it. None of this means never buy a car. It means understanding exactly what you're trading for it, instead of finding out later, the way Yolanda did, the way most people do. If this reframed something for you, you already know what quietly costs you the most. The next question is what you're going to do about it.